Good evening. My name is Jeanne Obert, and I'm the Executive Director of the Matrix Institute on Addictions. We started back in 1984 developing this matrix model of addiction, and we've been doing these lectures for a long time. They never get old because the audiences are always new, and I'm just delighted to be here with you tonight. The lecture that we get to talk about tonight is families in recovery. The most important thing that you can do is be involved with your family member in this recovery process. And that's a difficult thing to do, as you well know, because you've been involved in a war. Some of you may have known that you were involved in this war, and others of you may have just realized that there was a war going on and you didn't know that. The war has to do with brain chemistry. It has to do with addiction. And the enemy in this war is not necessarily the person who's addicted. The enemy in this war is the addiction itself. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're actually going to talk a little bit about how that process occurs. And you may recognize some things about the process that were going on that you didn't realize were going on as the process began. Because that's often what happens for family members. The process starts long before you realize there's a problem. And the person with the addiction often doesn't realize there's a problem too when it first starts developing. That's what we call the introductory phase. And this introductory phase happens at a lot of different levels. A lot of different things happen in the introductory phase, in different parts of the brain and with different parts of our behavior. We're going to break that down a little bit. And for those of you who are in the treatment program, you may have already heard a lecture about this. What we're going to do is give you the same kind of information so that people who are new get the information. And we're also going to talk about how that information relates specifically to those of you who are family members. Because that is a very different kind of relationship. In the introductory phase, somebody is just using a drug or alcohol because it works. And they're using it for a lot of different things. We all do that. We all use, most of us, different forms of substances to help us do certain things. And these are some of the positive aspects that you see on the screen that substances do. Some of the positive things that they can do is give you increased status. I mean, way back when I was in college, I smoked cigarettes. That was before cigarettes were dangerous. I smoked cigarettes because it was a trendy thing to do. I mean, they taught us how to smoke in a ladylike way, not walk with your cigarette, but only smoke when you're sitting down, those kinds of things. There were social rules around how to smoke. But we did it because it was sophisticated and chic thing to do. There are ads that promote that, right? There are other things that we do. We sometimes drink because it makes us more comfortable in a social setting. We use other drugs for other reasons, but it's all because they do these nice positive things, give us more energy, help us enjoy sex more, help us work more productively, improve our ability to think. Stimulants are particularly good at doing all of these things when you first start using them, and if you use them just once in a while, occasionally. And when you first start using, there really aren't very many negative things. A lot of bad stuff doesn't start happening in this introductory phase. In the introductory phase then, in terms of what your brain recognizes and what happens with your brain, not much. You use the drugs for the purposes that we described. You use them at parties. You use them on special occasions or for certain reasons. And your brain goes, okay, fine, you're using it, and you think nice things about it, and that's it. That's the extent of it. In terms of your thinking, obsessive thinking, that doesn't start happening yet. So what's going on in a person's brain during this introductory stage is a lot of normal stuff. All the same stuff that goes on in everybody's brains. And one piece of that is occasionally I use this particular substance to help me X, whatever that is. But it doesn't, it's not a big deal. It's just a small part of your overall lifestyle. So at this point, family members of whoever is using the substance don't really recognize that there's any problem, because there isn't really much of a problem. In fact, family members may admire what somebody is able to do using substances. In other words, you may say to the person, wow, that was amazing that you were able to get that project done. Or to a truck driver, or I can't believe that you finished that haul so quickly, that you were able to drive all night long. That's pretty amazing that you were able to do that. Or to a student, how did you get that project done? The beginning of the night, you hadn't even started it. Now it's in the morning and you're finished. That's incredible. A lot of positive admiration for what the person was able to do. Or, have you ever said this or heard somebody say, that's incredible you were able to drink that much and not even get drunk. You don't even act drunk, right? So there's a lot of admiration for some of these kind of abnormal behaviors that are sometimes accomplished with the assistance of a substance. And so the person keeps using, because it works. So they keep using it for those reasons, and only now they use it a little more frequently. Now the use increases a little bit more. Now, they found out it works for these things, let's try it for something else, and let's use it a little more frequently. So now there are still very many positive aspects to it. Still does a lot of positive stuff, but there begin to be a few problems. There begin to be a few problems, perhaps at work, perhaps coming in late to work, perhaps on a regular basis, and every Monday. It's a dead giveaway. Maybe it's not work, maybe it's money. Maybe money begins to sort of disappear without any indication of why. Maybe what happens is you begin having relationship problems because of the money, perhaps, or for some other reason. But little problems that are related to the ongoing drug use begin to crop up here and there. And they just are small indicators of things to come. Maybe there's the beginning of a physiologic dependence, and we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. And so the person continues using and uses gradually more and more. Now there are a lot of different situations in which the person may be using. Maybe at parties, maybe on Friday nights, maybe because you're gaining weight or because weight gain is an issue, maybe because there are sexual situations in which you decide to use. For all kinds of reasons, maybe not because you intend to, but just because you happen to have some extra money, or maybe because you feel kind of down and you need something to cheer you up, or maybe you live in Washington State or Minnesota and you have seasonal affective disorder and you need something to help you feel a little better because the sun hasn't been out for days and days. It can be any reason. but the use increases. And now what happens when you think about using is you begin to feel it. You begin to feel the hair on your arm stand up a little bit, or the back of your neck, or your heart beats a little faster. Your pulse rate increases. You feel a little rush of adrenaline. That kind of thing can't happen to somebody who has never used before. That happens, and we're going to talk more about this in a minute, when you just think about using. And so, what happens is the whole thought process changes a little, and you spend a little more time deciding whether or not you're going to use, a little more time thinking about where you're going to get the money to get the substance, how you're going to get it without somebody knowing, if you used and you didn't mean to, or you used more or longer than you meant to, how do you cover that up? All those issues begin occurring. As a result of that, you have AOD, which stands for alcohol and other drugs. You have more AOD thoughts, more thoughts around the use of the drug and all of the issues that we just described. So what happens to family members during this time? Well, obviously there are little hints of problems. And so what happens with family members is they try some solutions. Some kinds of solutions like maybe, well, let me see. Maybe if when we go to this party tonight and I'm worried that my spouse is going to drink too much, maybe what I'll do is not drink anything. And maybe if I don't drink anything, I'll set an example, and that means he or she will drink less. Or maybe, I've noticed that every time we have that certain set of friends over, there's a little too much drug and alcohol use going on. So maybe I'll just avoid them. We just won't have those people over anymore, and maybe that will help solve the problem. And all those different kinds of things, you try different things, nothing quite works, but you keep trying to figure out how to get control when things start looking like they're out of control. And it keeps increasing, these situations keep increasing in frequency and in the degree to which the problems occur. And so after a while, you try some kind of extreme responses. I'm going to tell you a little story about a patient, a couple that I was treating who tried a very extreme response. They were going to get married. And she decided she wasn't going to marry this guy who had a cocaine problem. Obviously, that would be silly. But he said, I'm going to go into treatment, I want to get married, I'm going to stop using, and as soon as I'm through treatment, they both agreed, we'll get married. Okay, no problem. He was using intranasal cocaine. You know how long ago that was. It's not everybody using intranasal cocaine, but if you remember, if those of you who know about cocaine use, you know that when you're snorting cocaine, there's residue. There's obviously sometimes residue that's left in the inside of your nose after you snort cocaine. So what the two of them decided was that in order to make her feel comfortable, anytime he came home too late or came home doing suspicious things or whatever, he would allow her to use a little swab of a t-shirt, navy blue t-shirt, and swab the inside of his nose to see if they could find any leftover cocaine residue. And they had this little ritual that they went through where she sort of did this policing thing in order to make sure that the drug use wasn't occurring. That is an extreme response. Understandable when you listen to the story. It's understandable how people can get to that place, but that is an extreme response to her trying to take control or trying to be reassured that the drug use isn't going on. You might be able to think of other situations in which you know similar kinds of things have happened. And that kind of behavior can then move right into what has popularly been called enabling behavior. Enabling behavior is really just the family member or somebody who cares trying to help in ways that are overly helpful, like calling somebody's boss to tell them that they won't be in when it's a Monday and they're missing work one more time on a Monday. Surely the boss is much less likely to fire the person if his wife calls and says he's sick than if he just doesn't show up. And so she does that to cover for him so he won't lose his job. Enabling responses are things that family members do in order to help avoid, for everybody, the consequences of the behavior that has happened. So that's what we're talking about now. We've gotten to a point where the family member has to begin this sort of dance to make it all keep working, because otherwise it's going to fall apart. And it happens very slowly, it happens very gradually, and pretty soon you're in the disenchantment phase before you ever know it. What is the disenchantment phase? The disenchantment phase is that point at which the drug's no longer working. Whatever it is you're using, and for whatever reason you started using it, it isn't working anymore for that reason. Now, the truth is that lots of people stop using when that happens. Lots of people are able to just say, hey, this isn't working anymore, clearly, and I better stop before it gets any worse. Why is it that some people can say that and just walk away from it? And we know that it's not a simple answer, it's a complicated answer. It's a complicated answer involving a lot of biology, a lot of environmental stuff, a lot of behavioral, family kinds of things. All of that goes into why some people are able to say, okay, this is a problem, I'm not going to do this anymore. And other people get swept into this thing we call addiction. We don't know enough yet to know what that's entirely about. But what we do know is that if a person is using, continues to use, despite the fact that there aren't as many good things coming from it anymore, and there are more negative things, you see, the negative factors here outweigh the positive now. There's more negative stuff going on than positive. Nosebleeds and infections and losing your job and going broke and losing your family, all of those kinds of things, wouldn't you think that somebody would be able to stop? And they're not able to stop. And you know people that that's happened to. Celebrities, well-known people who have lost their careers, as well as family members and other people, are not able to stop because they're dependent on whatever this drug is. It's a brain chemistry thing that's happened. It's above and beyond a conscious, rational decision to just walk away. And now there are lots of things that result in the person using. Too numerous to even mention. It covers all kinds of territory. Triggers can be, any weekend and all kinds of friends and any kind of stress, a lot of different emotional triggers, depression and boredom and any kind of weight gain, or all kinds of triggers now can result in the person not just using, but before they even use, having these overwhelming urges to use, these powerful cravings to use. And so what happens with the obsessive thinking process is that they think more about it. They think more about whether or not they should use, how they're not going to use again. how they're going to deal with the situations that are arising out of the fact that they're using too much, et cetera, et cetera. So it ends up, these AOD thoughts, alcohol and other drug related thoughts, start replacing a lot of other things. Notice on this head that we have here that AOD has replaced a lot of the things that were there. Some of the person's interests, some of the things that they did so well, some of the things they enjoyed, some of the people that they enjoyed have now been replaced by this obsession of thinking about the drug. So what's a family member to do when it gets to that point? What happens to the person who's involved with somebody who gets to that point? Well, first of all, you've tried all kinds of things. You've tried everything that you can think of. What do we do in a situation when we've tried everything that we can think of and nothing works? What we sometimes do as human beings is sort of ignore the problem. Do the best you can to keep going without the problem getting in your way, right? You work around it, kind of, as best you can. That's one way of coping with it. Another thing that sometimes happens is we blame the person who has the addiction problem. They're making life difficult for us. If they just wouldn't do X, I wouldn't have to be in this situation. Or we blame ourselves. I should have known. I shouldn't have married somebody who came from a family where there were a lot of addicts. I shouldn't have married somebody who had an addiction problem in the past, even though we thought it was behind us. I shouldn't have whatever. Somehow, this should have been able to be avoided, and I should have been able to avoid it. And a lot of guilt and shame happens to the family member for a number of different reasons, partly because you're in that situation. It's like, how did this happen to us? How did it happen to me? How did it happen to my child if you're a parent of somebody who's addicted? How in the world, what did I do wrong as a parent? Where did I go wrong? What should I have done differently to have avoided this? Lots of guilt and shame about this whole problem, because it's a problem that in our society today gets viewed that way, gets imbued with this sort of sense of moral wrong, that somehow there's something wrong with the person who gets addicted. You know, we know enough from the research to know that that's not true. We know that addiction is a chronic relapsing condition like any other. We know that we can compare it to diabetes or hypertension or any other chronic relapsing condition. That's what addiction is. You didn't hear me any time I was starting in these stages say, at this stage, the person decided, I want to be an addict. And so they continued using. That doesn't happen. That isn't how addiction happens. You're in it before you know it. You know? So the guilt and shame, even though it isn't really justified by what we know about addiction today, it's there. It's somehow part of our society today. And family members have to cope with that. And so the disaster stage sometimes occurs if somebody doesn't get into treatment or somehow this cycle ends, they end up in the disaster stage. And the disaster stage is that stage at which the drug does almost nothing. And what it does do, any positive effects that it has are very minuscule and quick and minor. Many more negative effects. But the person continues using because now it's a disease of the brain and now it's an ingrained addiction problem that is difficult to deal with, despite the fact that you're losing weight, You're so paranoid you can't stand it. You're having seizures perhaps. You're very depressed. You've lost your job. Maybe you've lost your family. All these terrible things have happened. It's not in your control anymore, because now what happens is almost anything out there, and we really shouldn't have on this slide triggers listed, because people who are addicted and are in this disaster stage will tell you that everything is a trigger. Waking up in the morning is a trigger. Going to sleep at night is a trigger. Everything is a trigger. And if, in fact, in treatment, just a little postscript here, in treatment, when we're helping people identify their triggers, and that's one of the big things that we do in treatment, is help people get very specific about what their individual triggers are. If you are somebody who is in the disaster stage of an addictive problem, it's very difficult to identify any trigger, because everything's a trigger. What you can do is think back to when you weren't that addicted. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you can go back in your mind to an earlier stage of the addiction, you'll be able to identify what those triggers were. And that's what we do in treatment. That's part of a very important part of the treatment process, is coming up with a chart for yourself of what those triggers are. During this disaster stage, though, all you have to do is like wake up in the morning and you get overwhelmed with this whole process of addiction and obsessively thinking about it. Look at this. This is what it looks like in the disaster stage. Do you see any family and friends in that person's thoughts? No. Have those of you who are family members ever said, how come that drug is more important than I am? Have you ever said that? Well, now you know. It's not a contest. There's no contest here. Look at that. You can't fight that. There's no room for a relationship when you're this addicted. It's impossible. It's not a choice. It's a disease that completely takes you over, and including all of your thoughts and everything that's important to you. You don't see any job there. You don't see any friends, family, much less recreational activities. Those were replaced a long time ago. So what is a family member to do at this point? Well, what we usually do is a couple of things. We have some choices. Sometimes we separate. Sometimes this is the point at which we decide, a family member decides that if we don't get out of this ship now, we're going to go down with it, right? And so it's like you gotta get out of the way and let the person deal with this problem or not on their own. It's a very sad thing. But sometimes that is what we do. And sometimes family members have to have a lot of help to do that. Sometimes they want to do that, but it's a very, very difficult thing to do. So that sometimes is the focus of counseling for family members whose significant other hasn't gotten into recovery. If you don't do that, and even if you do that, there are a lot of bad feelings that get internalized at this stage. There's a lot of feeling of hopelessness and resignation, and I just don't understand what went on. We tried everything that we could, and now, here we are in this situation, and there's nothing more that I can do about it. But you're still sometimes, in some cases, haven't separated. And in other cases, haven't completely separated. You have times when you're together, but you don't want the addiction to get in the way. So what happens is you start living by a set of rules that don't sort of trigger the addiction to the front. A set of rules that make everything seem okay, like, all right, no matter what happens, I've got to be happy. I'm going to appear happy, and I'm going to rise above this, and I'm going to be okay, and no matter what anybody says to me, it's going to be all right. I can tell you I'm okay, and so are my kids. We're all right. We're doing okay. So the rule is, don't talk about it when you don't feel good. Don't talk about it when you have a problem. Don't talk to anybody about problems that you have, because you got to keep going. You know, and if I start to talk about it, it gets a little too close, and I might not make it through. So don't talk about it. Stay happy, keep functioning, and try to figure out how you got into this in the first place, so it won't happen again. That kind of thing. All right, so those are the stages that you go through in this process. What can we do about that? Well, first I want to make sure that everybody understands the power of the brain chemistry that we were talking about. I said we would come back to this, and this is what I was talking about. This is the craving response that is your indication that this is a brain disease. Because what we know happens, in a nutshell, is that initially the person starts using, they use the drug, they go buy the drug, they get the drug effects, right? That's what we said at the beginning stages. In the introductory stage, it's all a very rational process. Nothing happens in any other part of the brain. It's all in my cerebral cortex. It's all a logical, rational decision that I'm making to use every time I use. So I keep using, and then it begins to change a little bit. Now what happens is I make a decision to use. I go to wherever I get the substance. I get the substance, and I put it in my pocket or my purse or my grocery bag or whatever. I walk out of that place, and I start to feel a little bit like I've used. I start to get a little bit of the effect of the drug. I can feel the drug. If you've never used before and you went and bought the drug, that wouldn't happen to you. But it does happen. The brain remembers. The brain knows what happens when you use this drug, and you start, some of you in this room who are recovering may be experiencing this as I talk about it. That's not unusual. That sometimes does happen. Don't leave the room until you talk to somebody if that's the case. Make sure you talk to somebody before you leave. That's your addicted brain firing up. That's what's going on. And in this disenchantment phase, you don't even have to go purchase the drug for this to happen. All you have to do is be sitting in this room listening to me talk about it for this long. All you have to be doing is sitting in class thinking about using, or sitting on the bus stop bench, or anywhere. You can be anywhere, and all of a sudden, boom, you start thinking about using, and what happens? You start feeling it physiologically. You start getting a little adrenaline rush. You start hyperventilating a little bit. You start feeling the hair stand up on the back of your neck. You start that process of that neurochemistry going into your system. The dopamine, the norepinephrine, serotonin start going into your system. And that drives you to going and getting the drug. That biochemical process pushes you toward using. And then you use the drug and you get the full effect. So that in the end, in the disaster stage, just thinking about the drug is as pleasurable as using. In fact, some people in the disaster stage will tell you that it's even more pleasurable because they're toxic to the drug at this point. So that doesn't mean that they can stop, but thinking about using brings a full force physiologic response to the idea of using this drug. All right. Why then and how is it so important for family members to be involved? These are some of the reasons. Number one, if you are involved in the treatment process, and we have ways, we have tools, we have ways in treatment to deal with what we just described. We need to have that, because you can't make a decision to stop at that point and just walk away from it. The people who can do that aren't in treatment. They already walked away from it. The people who are in treatment, they need information. They need information and they need tools. And that's what treatment offers. And if a family member is involved in that treatment process, it is much more likely to be successful. And it's so hard to do. I mean, who wants to be involved in the treatment? You got dragged into the problem. You didn't really want to be part of the problem. Let the person go get recovered and then I'll deal with them again. It's very hard to bring yourself. Why should I go to treatment? It wasn't my problem. But if you're involved in treatment, it's much more likely to be successful. We know that for a fact. We know that it's going to be easier for you to be part of this process if you know what to expect next. And we can tell you that while you're involved in this process. We have a roadmap for this recovery. We can tell you what to expect during the recovery process. Some of it may surprise you. You need a guide along the way, and being involved in it will help. You need to understand what you can do that's helpful and what isn't helpful. Family members want to help in the process, but sometimes our gut instinct about what to do to help is incorrect. It's not helpful. So you need to be somewhere where you can get information about what really is helpful and to support your person in recovery while they go through the recovery process. Okay, there are certain sequenced goals that we can expect. For the clients, they have specific goals in these phases of recovery. They have specific things at different stages they're going to do. And for the whole first 6 weeks, they're going to be focused on these goals. Stopping the drug use. That's the first goal. Number one goal. By the way, if it doesn't happen immediately, right out of the gate and all together, don't worry. That's normal. But stopping the drug use is the first goal. Understanding more about the drugs is the second goal. Learning about these psychoactive drugs. That's an important piece. Getting healthier. Learning about the psychiatric issues, learning about the physical issues. For the person who's been involved with the drug, they need to relearn all of that as part of the early recovery. And they need to get some help in evaluating how much the addiction has affected them and what they need to do as a result of that in the recovery process. All of those things for family members. Well, guess what? For clients. Family members also have things that they need to do in the first part. First of all, they need to make a commitment to being involved in the process. And you've all maybe done that. Maybe you're just here tonight to it out. If you are, hopefully you will make a commitment to be involved in this process. Very important. Hopefully you can learn to recognize this thing we call addiction as a medical condition in the way that we talked about earlier. You'll hear a lot of that if you keep coming. hopefully you'll be able to support in a positive way your family members stopping the use of drugs and alcohol. And we'll be talking about that a lot. And also recognizing, you'll learn to recognize and to discontinue situations that are triggering situations. What we've done is we have something that we call a helping checklist. The helping checklist is something that if you keep coming in and you come to individual sessions with the counselor and the person who's in recovery, the family member, the person in recovery, and the counselor will come up with a contract. A contract for how you can best help in this process. Now, a contract has to be agreed to by both parties, correct? Right. So this contract is going to consist of things that the person who's addicted thinks are going to be helpful to them, because that's important, and that the family member agrees they're willing to do. You shouldn't be willing to do it just because it's important to the person. You have to think about yourself and what you're willing to do to help in this recovery process. Some people will tell you what you can do to help is leave right now and go to Al-Anon. Going to Al-Anon is a great thing to do. But you also need to be positively involved in the recovery process. It's your process too. And you're just starting in this process. And so you need to understand what your part of the process is. There are a whole list here of things that you might choose to go into that contract. Things like you as a family member might say, I will allow you to wake me during the night to talk when you can't sleep. However, maybe you have 2 jobs because the other person hasn't had a job for a while. And maybe you can't afford to sit up and talk for a couple of hours in the middle of the night. So you might say, that one I'm not willing to do because I can't function and do that. But maybe I am willing to remind you of the reasons that you wanted to stop using when you forget. If you want me to do that, do you want me to do that? See, this is a negotiation, and these things are only suggestions. And you'll have a list of these in your session. We have a handout for you, and you'll be working with your counselor from a list, and you can make up your own too. You may come up with ones that aren't even on the list. There are a different set of goals for later stages in recovery. The middle stage in recovery is maybe from about 6 to 20 weeks. So it may go until the initial phase of treatment stops. This middle stage of recovery has different goals. For the person who's in the program who has the addiction, one of their goals is to improve their significant relationships, both with you, maybe with their kids, or parents, or boss, their significant relationships, to improve those, to maintain a stable abstinence from drugs, ongoing, to develop a support system outside the recovery center. That means have friends who don't drink and use. And they might be different people than you as a family member have for friends. Sometimes that is very helpful. Sometimes that's what happens when people go to 12-step meetings. Sometimes that's kind of lonely for family members to have that happen. That's a positive thing. It's a positive thing that the person can go to meetings and start to develop a set of friends that they can do things with other than drinking and using. It's also important for clients to recognize and cope with their emotions. They're starting to learn to do that, and they're not going to be perfect at it. So What do family members need to do? Well, first of all, you need to be committed to the relationship. You need to decide if you're going to be. I have seen family members try to be involved in the process, but they weren't really fully committed. And so every time something started to go wrong, the family member would say, well, you know, if you don't do this way, I'm not going to hang around here. I'm not going to stay. And that doesn't work very well. So family members need to stay committed to the process, both to the treatment process, being engaged in the treatment process, and in the relationship in general. Family members need to learn to be supportive rather than to do things that are codependent or co-addicted. That means learning healthy ways to help, like we discussed before. Family members also are going to have a lot more time because you're not spending as much time taking care of somebody else. And you need to find things that you're excited about for your own life. You can go back and do some of the stuff that you stopped doing, that you really like to do. You need to enrich your life in ways that you'd forgotten how to do. That's a very important part of the recovery process for family members. Pick up some of those pieces that got dropped. And learn healthy communication skills, because those kind of break down when you've got somebody who's got an active using addiction going on. So part of what you can do in your conjoint sessions is learn healthy communication, or in some other kind of therapy. Now, what we do during this middle stage is, with your therapist, develop a new contract, because there are different things that you're going to do. So this new contract looks a little different than the other contract. And you, as a family member, may say, these are just examples, as I said, I will listen supportively, be understanding, and talk to you about my feelings. Remember back when we talked about that kind of breaks down and you stop doing that at some point? Well, I'm going to learn to do that again as a family member. I'm going to listen to you, but I'm also going to talk to you about how I feel, because guess what? How I feel is just as important as how you feel. So I, as a family member, am going to learn to do that. I'm not going to be a police officer. I'm not going to be bullied into doing things because you threaten to use if I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to allow that to happen. I'm going to do one nice thing every day to make my life better as a family member. I am going to be responsible for my own behavior, not for yours. These are items that you want to negotiate. You want to sit down and have a discussion with your therapist about which ones of these fit for you. They won't all fit for you, but some of them will. At this later stage, clients are doing different things too. What are the clients doing? Well, what they need to do is identify and monitor the things that they have to do in order to stay in sobriety, and get very clear about what those things are. We call those mooring lines, and we have a whole session on identifying those mooring lines. What keeps you sober? What are the 3 or 4 most important things that you do to stay sober? And then monitoring that you continue doing those things. What are your relapse indicators? We hope everybody, when they leave the intensive phase of treatment, knows exactly, this is a successful treatment episode. If you leave treatment and you know exactly when you're in trouble, what are the indicators that you're in trouble? I know that if I begin doing X, I'm in trouble. And not just that. That's one piece of it. The other piece is, what are you going to do about that? So knowing when you're in trouble and having a very specific way to respond to those indicators is real important for patients who are in this later stage of recovery. Clarifying new roles and boundaries in sober relationships, learning how to have friends. It's a whole new ballgame. These are not just acquaintances who are also users. These are friends. Those relationships are different. Learning how to have a friend, learning how to be a friend, these are things clients do in the later stages of recovery. And setting goals for a continuing new lifestyle. What do family members do in these later stages? They still have something to do too. Family members need to learn to accept the limitations of living with somebody who has an addiction. What does that mean? I'll give you an example. For instance, it may mean when we go to a restaurant, if they say there's going to be a half-hour wait for a table and you can wait over there in the bar, we say, no, thank you, we'll go find another place. And as a family member, you do that cheerfully and you recognize that as something that you choose to do rather than saying, oh, can't we just go to the bar and have ginger ale or something? I really, really want to eat here. That type of thing. Develop a healthy, balanced lifestyle for myself as a family member. Make my own life healthy and balanced. Monitor myself as a family member for relapses. Relapses to taking care of the other person. Relapses to not taking care of me. And I need to also, as a family member, be patient with the process of recovery. It's a long, long, lifelong process. Just know that. Did you know that more people are successful the second time they try recovery than the first? And even more people are successful the third time than the first or the second. So people don't fail when they have to do recovery more than one time. It's a natural part of the process. It is possible to do it the first time. So if you're in your first time, that doesn't mean you're not going to be successful. However, don't feel discouraged if it isn't perfect the first time, because the process is a fairly long process. So you develop a helping checklist at the end here with the therapist that looks more like, I will pursue my personal goals and interests, and remember that you need to pursue your own. You have a healthy relationship when you can both separate and do your own thing without getting very anxious, and then come back together. Separate and come back together without a lot of anxiety going on around that. That's a healthy relationship. A relationship where both people have a really strong lifestyle of their own going on that enhances the other person's but isn't dependent on it. And so, you need to know what are the key relapse issues. Now, you need to know what the specific relapse issues are for the person that you care about who's in recovery. But some of the biggest issues for people in general are using other drugs besides the drug they were addicted to. Alcohol, number one. Everybody wants to be able to drink like a normie. Drink like somebody who doesn't have an addiction problem. But alcohol takes more people back to relapses than any other drug, and marijuana too, by the way. Use of those two drugs, if you were addicted to something else, tends to lead to relapse more than any other thing. What else do we know? Hanging around drug-using friends. That's a big problem, a big cause of relapse. Triggers. Triggers are a big problem. Severe cravings. Cravings are a huge problem. We teach people in recovery how to deal with those cravings. We teach people in recovery how to do what we call thought stopping and deal with the craving process. But the first thing you should do is avoid all triggers. And so you may have to help as a family member in helping the person avoid their triggers. Recognizing this wall syndrome, getting through the wall, is a difficult process. You'll learn more about that in recovery. Stimulant and sex, that connection is a big cause of relapse. And boredom. So what are the things that you as family members need to be careful of ongoing, long term? What are the key relapse issues for family members? Meaning the things that might trigger you to relapse back to old behaviors. Well, some of those things are emotional situations. Emotional situations where you find yourself all of a sudden scared. It's like, oh my gosh, this feels like it used to feel when X was happening. And so you start to behave as if that is occurring. And that's dangerous because when you start behaving that way, you can actually cause it to occur, sort of. You can move it in that direction. You're sort of playing your role in the part of the relapse actually happening. So when you feel emotionally triggered like that, you need to back out of the situation. That is a relapse for a family member. Other things that can relapse family members: fear of being alone. I feel uncomfortable and anxious when I have to go and do things by myself. If I'm going to go develop my own interests, or if I'm going to stay here while you go do your thing, that makes me feel anxious. That kind of feeling can lead to a relapse for a family member. Lack of having individual goals or interests. It's not easy to come up with goals and interests of your own, especially when it's all been focused on this addiction. It's really hard to get back to thinking about what you want to do for your own life. So not doing that can get you into trouble. It's important for family members to do that. The last really key relapse indicator for family members is when you feel yourself starting to take responsibility for other people. You can only be responsible for yourself. It doesn't feel that way because you've spent a lot of time being responsible for everybody else and holding everything together. So when you start feeling like you need to be doing that again, that's a relapse indicator for a family member. The actual fact is that you are here tonight engaged in this recovery process. That is a very important piece of this whole recovery process. And I congratulate you for being here tonight. I hope you continue coming. It's very important to the process that you continue coming. And I have to tell you that there is a rainbow at the end of this tunnel. If you continue coming, you will be glad because the results can be absolutely stupendous. So hang in there, keep coming back, and thank you for coming tonight.